The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Henderson adjusted his red tunic for what seemed like the 100th time. At 28 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for nearly 5 years. But the weight of responsibility never quite left his shoulders. His polished black boots reflected the early light, and his tall bearskin hat sat perfectly centered on his head. Behind the stoic expression that tourists photographed endlessly, Marcus carried a mind trained for crisis and a heart that still remembered why he had chosen this path. Marcus came from a small town in 9th Yorkshire, where his father had worked in the coal mines and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Growing up, he watched his parents struggle, but never complain. They taught him dignity in hardship and strength in silence. When Marcus was 16, a burglar broke into their modest home one winter night. His father, unarmed and untrained, had simply stood between the intruder and his family, speaking in calm, measured tones until the young man, barely older than Marcus himself, broke down in tears and surrendered. The police arrived to find Marcus's father making tea for the would-be thief, listening to his story of desperation and poor choices. That night changed Marcus forever. He learned that true courage was not about violence or aggression, but about keeping your humanity when chaos erupted around you. Now, standing at his post outside the palace, Marcus embodied that lesson every single day. Tourists often mocked the guards, trying to make them laugh or flinch. Children would wave frantically, hoping for a smile. Some visitors were respectful, taking photos from a distance and marveling at the tradition. Others were less considerate, pushing boundaries and testing patience. Through it all, Marcus remained still as a statue, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his eyes focused on the middle distance. But beneath that practiced stillness, he remained alert to everything happening around him. On this particular Tuesday morning, the crowd seemed typical. A group of Japanese tourists clustered together, their guide explaining the history of the changing of the guard ceremony. An elderly couple from Scotland shared a thermos of tea, reminiscing about their wedding day 50 years prior when they had visited this same spot. 3 teenagers giggled as they attempted to take selfies with Marcus, careful not to touch him, but coming close enough that he could smell their strawberry-scented chewing gum. A street artist sketched the scene from across the road, his weathered hands moving quickly across the paper. Marcus noticed them all, cataloging details the way he had been trained. The woman in the blue coat, who kept checking her watch, the delivery driver who seemed confused about where to make his drop-off, the young mother struggling to control her twin toddlers, who wanted to run in opposite directions. These observations were automatic now, a background process running constantly in his mind while he maintained his ceremonial stillness. What Marcus did not yet notice was the man in the gray hoodie, who had been circling the perimeter for the past 20 minutes. The man kept his head down, hands shoved deep in his pockets, moving with the jerky nervousness of someone carrying a terrible burden. His name was David Crawford, and 48 hours earlier, he had made the worst mistake of his life. David had been a mechanic, a father of 2, and a husband of 12 years. He had also been desperate. When his daughter needed surgery that insurance would not cover, when the bills piled higher than he could climb. When loan sharks started making threats, David had done something unthinkable. He had robbed a convenience store with his brother's old service pistol, never imagining the clerk would fight back or that surveillance. Cameras would capture everything in brutal clarity. The robbery had gone wrong in every possible way. The clerk, a former boxer, had grabbed for the gun. In the struggle, a shot had been fired, shattering bottles behind the counter, but miraculously hitting no one. David had run, leaving behind his wallet, his hope, and any chance at a normal future. For 2 days, he had been on the run, sleeping in parks and abandoned buildings, watching his face appear on news broadcasts and his daughter's tear-streaked face begging him to turn himself in. The police were closing in. His phone, which he had been too afraid to turn on, was likely being tracked. His friends would not harbor a fugitive. His family begged him to surrender. David Crawford was a man with nowhere left to run and nothing left to lose. That morning, as dawn broke over London, David had made a decision. He was tired of running, tired of fear, tired of the person he had become. He wanted to end this, but not by walking into a police station like a common criminal. He wanted something bigger, something that would make people remember that he had been desperate, not evil. In his confused and exhausted mind, he thought that if he could make a scene at one of London's most famous landmarks, people would have to listen to his story. They would have to understand why a good man had been pushed to do bad things. It was the logic of someone who had not slept properly in days, someone operating on adrenaline and despair rather than reason. David had no plan to hurt anyone. The gun tucked in his waistband had only one bullet left, and he had already decided that if it came to it, that bullet was meant for himself. He just wanted someone to listen, someone to see him as a human being rather than a criminal. As he circled the palace grounds, his eyes fell on the guards in their distinctive uniforms. They represented order, authority, everything he had lost. They stood so still, so certain, while his life had crumbled into chaos. David felt anger rise in his chest, not at the guards themselves, but at what they symbolized, a world that worked for some people but had failed him completely. Marcus first noticed David when the man in the gray hoodie stopped pacing and stood perfectly still about 30 feet away, staring directly at him. There was something in that stare that made Marcus's training kick into high alert. The man's hands were out of his pockets now, trembling slightly. His lips were moving, as if he was talking to himself or praying. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Marcus had seen that look before in training videos and security briefings. It was the look of someone who had reached the end of their rope and was about to do something desperate. The moment stretched impossibly long as Marcus watched David through his peripheral vision, maintaining his forward-facing stance while every nerve in his body screamed alert. Around them, tourists continued their chatter, completely unaware that something was about to happen. The Japanese tour guide was explaining the significance of the bearskin hats. The elderly Scottish couple had moved closer, trying to get a better photograph. The teenagers were now attempting a synchronized dance in front of Marcus, filming themselves for social media. None of them saw what Marcus saw, the subtle shift in David's posture. The way his right hand moved slowly toward his demise to be. Indeed. In that frozen moment, Marcus had choices. He could break protocol and shout a warning, potentially causing panic among dozens of innocent civilians. He could signal to his fellow guards or the armed officers stationed nearby, initiating a response that would likely end with David being surrounded by weapons. He could follow his training exactly as written, treating David as an active threat and responding with appropriate force. All of these options were available. All were defensible. And all would likely result in David Crawford's death or capture within minutes. But Marcus thought of his father, standing in their small kitchen at midnight, making tea for a desperate young man who had broken into their home. He thought of the lesson learned that long ago night, that every person, no matter their circumstances, deserves to be seen as human first. David's hand closed around the grip of the pistol. His eyes, red-rimmed and wild, locked onto Marcus. In a voice that cracked with emotion, David called out, demanding attention. The words tumbled from him in a desperate rush. He wanted everyone to know his name, to know about his daughter, to understand that he was not a monster. He was a father who had run out of options. He was a husband who had failed to protect his family. He was a man who society had abandoned, and now he would make them listen. His hand pulled the weapon free, and the morning air suddenly filled with screams. The tourists scattered like birds startled by a gunshot, though no shot had been fired yet. The teenagers dropped their phones and ran. The elderly couple clutched each other, frozen in fear. The tour guide was already on her phone, frantically reporting the situation to emergency services. Within seconds, the cheerful morning scene had transformed into chaos. People pushed and shoved, desperate to escape. A child was knocked down in the rush and began crying for her mother. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail as the palace security system registered a threat. Through it all, Marcus remained still. While everyone else ran, while David Crawford stood with his weapon raised and his finger on the trigger, while the world erupted into panic and noise, Marcus Henderson did not move. He kept his eyes forward, his stance perfect, his breathing controlled. To the casual observer, It might have seemed like shock or fear that kept him rooted in place. But David, staring at this guard who refused to react, slowly began to understand that something else was happening. Marcus was not ignoring the threat. He was acknowledging David's humanity by refusing to treat him as nothing more than a dangerous animal. David's hand shook violently as he pointed the weapon in Marcus's general direction. He shouted again, his voice breaking, demanding that Marcus look at him, react to him, acknowledge him. But Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. By remaining calm, by refusing to escalate, Marcus was offering David something no one else had in days: respect. He was saying without words that David was worth more than panic and violence. That this situation, however desperate, did not have to end in tragedy. Backup arrived within 90 seconds, but those 90 seconds felt like hours. Armed response officers took positions around the courtyard, their weapons trained on David. A negotiator was being rushed to the scene. The area was being evacuated in an organized but urgent manner. Protocol demanded that Marcus be moved to safety, that the ceremonial guard be replaced by tactical response. But Marcus, through subtle hand signals visible only to his fellow guards and security personnel, indicated that he wanted to stay. He believed with every fiber of his being that leaving now would break whatever fragile connection existed between him and the desperate man with the gun. The negotiator arrived. A woman named Sarah Chen, who had talked down 17 potentially violent situations in her career. She approached slowly, her hands visible and empty, her voice calm and professional. She told David her name and asked for his. She acknowledged his pain and his fear. She promised that people would listen to his story if he would just put down the weapon. Sarah was exceptional at her job, trained in psychology and crisis intervention, experienced with desperate people and impossible situations. But David barely seemed to hear her. His eyes remained fixed on Marcus, on the guard who stood so impossibly still while the world collapsed around them. Marcus could hear Sarah's words, could feel the tension in the armed officers surrounding the scene, could sense the media helicopters that would soon be circling overhead. He knew that every second David held that weapon increased the likelihood of a tragic ending. Statistics, training, and common sense all suggested that situations like this rarely resolved peacefully once weapons were drawn. Yet Marcus also knew something that statistics could not measure. He knew that his father had saved a young man's life, not with force or fear, but with tea and patience. He knew that sometimes the most courageous thing a person could do was simply remain human in the face of inhumanity. David's daughter was named Emma. She was 7 years old and loved ballet and strawberry ice cream. She needed surgery to correct a heart defect, a routine procedure in countries with universal health care, but catastrophically expensive in the fragmented American system David had lived under before moving to London for work. When the surgery was deemed not immediately life-threatening, insurance had denied coverage. When David had appealed, they had denied again. When he had begged, borrowing from everyone he knew, he had come up short. The loan sharks had seemed like the only option until their interest rates made repayment impossible. The robbery had been a last resort, a desperate man's attempt to save his daughter's life. None of this excused what David had done. Marcus knew that. The law existed for good reasons. Actions had consequences. But Marcus also knew that reducing David to nothing more than an armed fugitive missed the full truth of who he was. David Crawford was a father driven to extremity by a broken system. He was a human being who deserved to be seen, truly seen, before being judged. So Marcus stood his ground literally and figuratively, offering the only thing he could: his presence, his calm, and his silent testimony that David's humanity mattered even now, especially now. The standoff continued, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths, while behind the scenes, machinery ground into motion that would determine how this story ended. Time moved differently during a crisis. Marcus had learned this during his military training before he became a ceremonial guard. In combat situations, seconds could feel like minutes, and minutes could feel like hours. The brain processed information at an accelerated rate, capturing details that would normally go unnoticed. Marcus was experiencing that now, hyper-aware of everything happening in the courtyard. He could hear David's ragged breathing from 30 feet away. He could see the slight tremor in the man's hands, the sweat running down his temples, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as he struggled with whatever decision was forming in his exhausted mind. Behind David, Sarah Chen continued her careful approach, speaking in low, soothing tones. She told David about her own father, who had lost his job during the recession and had struggled with depression. She shared just enough personal detail to establish connection without making the conversation about her. This was textbook negotiation. Build rapport, establish humanity, create a bridge between crisis and resolution. Sarah was excellent at her job, but Marcus could see that David was not responding to her words. His eyes remained locked on Marcus, searching for something in the guard's unwavering stance. Marcus understood what David was looking for because he had seen it before in different contexts. During his deployment in Afghanistan, before he returned home to take the ceremonial guard position, Marcus had been part of community outreach efforts in rural villages. He had learned that people in crisis, people who felt invisible and dismissed by larger powers, did not always need words. Sometimes they needed presence. They needed someone to bear witness to their pain without judgment or dismissal. David Crawford, in his desperate state, had chosen a Queen's Guard because the Guard represented everything official, everything powerful, everything that had failed him. And now David needed to know if there was any humanity left in that official power. The media had arrived in force now. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing every moment for broadcast around the world. Television trucks lined the streets beyond the security perimeter. Reporters spoke breathlessly into cameras, speculating about the armed man's identity and motives. Social media exploded with eyewitness videos, most filmed during the initial panic before people evacuated. Within minutes, the incident was trending globally. Millions of people were watching the standoff unfold in real time, though none of them knew the full story yet. They saw only an armed fugitive threatening a stoic guard at one of Britain's most famous landmarks. Inside the palace, security chiefs were making rapid decisions. The royal family had been moved to secure locations. Additional armed response units were being positioned. Snipers were finding angles. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner was being briefed. The mayor's office was being notified. At this level of crisis management, there were protocols for every contingency, including the one everyone feared. If David Crawford made any aggressive move toward Marcus or anyone else, he would be neutralized immediately. Multiple weapons were trained on him at this very moment, fingers resting just outside trigger guards, waiting for the order or the necessity. Marcus was aware of all of this peripheral activity, but his focus remained on David. Through years of training, Marcus had learned to read body language with precision. He could see that David's grip on the weapon was wrong, suggesting unfamiliarity despite the gun's presence. He could see that David's stance was defensive rather than aggressive, the posture of someone cornered rather than someone hunting. Most importantly, Marcus could see David's eyes, and what he saw there was not malice or madness. He saw grief, exhaustion, and a desperate need to be understood. This was not a terrorist or a killer. This was a broken man making a terrible final stand. Sarah Chen had moved closer now, close enough that David could easily turn the weapon toward her. She continued speaking, her voice never wavering, her hands visible and unthreatening. She told David that his daughter Emma was watching on television, that his wife was being brought to the scene, that people wanted to hear his story. She promised that if he put down the weapon, they would listen. She guaranteed his safety if he surrendered. These were not empty promises. Sarah had the authority to make these commitments, and she would honor them. For the first time since producing the weapon, David's attention shifted slightly toward Sarah. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. Tears began running down his face, though he seemed unaware of them. His whole body was shaking now, adrenaline and exhaustion taking their toll. The weapon wavered in his grip, pointing at the ground, then back up, then to the side. Each movement caused the surrounding officers to tense, their weapons tracking his every motion. Marcus could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and this would end in gunfire. In that moment of terrible tension, Marcus made a decision that defied all his training and protocol. He did something no ceremonial guard had ever done in a threat situation. Slowly, with movements so controlled they seemed almost supernatural, Marcus turned his head to look directly at David Crawford. He broke the ceremonial stance that required him to stare straight ahead. He broke the protocol that demanded he show no response to public provocation. He broke the rules that had governed the Queen's Guard for centuries. And he looked at David, truly looked at him, with eyes that held no judgment, no fear, only recognition of a fellow human being in pain. The crowd that had gathered at the security perimeter, the millions watching on television, the security personnel managing the crisis, none of them fully understood the significance of that simple gesture. But David Crawford understood. In that moment of eye contact, something fundamental shifted. For the first time in days, someone was truly seeing him. Not as a criminal, not as a threat, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. Marcus held David's gaze steadily, and in the silence between them, conversation happened that required no words. David's face crumpled. The weapon dropped from his shaking hand, hitting the cobblestones with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. He fell to his knees, hands raised in surrender, sobbing so hard his whole body convulsed with it. Within seconds, armed officers moved in, securing the weapon and surrounding David with professional efficiency. Sarah Chen was there too, placing a gentle hand on David's shoulder, speaking softly to him as he was handcuffed and searched. The immediate crisis was over. No shots had been fired. No one was injured. By any measurable standard, this was a successful resolution. But Marcus knew the real story was more complex than those simple facts suggested. As he finally allowed himself to move from his position, accepting the blanket and water offered by a concerned fellow guard, Marcus thought about what had really happened here. David Crawford had needed to be seen as human, and Marcus had given him that gift at considerable personal and professional risk. The question now was whether the rest of the world would see David's humanity too, or whether he would be reduced to headlines and hashtags, his story simplified into a cautionary tale. The hours following the incident passed in a blur of debriefings and medical checks. Marcus was escorted to a secure room inside the palace, where security officials, police investigators, and military superiors took turns questioning him about every detail of the confrontation. They wanted to know what he had observed when he had first noticed David Crawford, why he had not alerted backup sooner, and most pressingly, why he had broken protocol by making eye contact with an armed threat. Marcus answered their questions honestly, knowing that his actions would be scrutinized and likely criticized. The formal debriefing lasted 3 hours. Marcus sat at a plain table in an austere room, still wearing his ceremonial uniform, though his bearskin hat had been removed. Across from him, a rotation of officials asked questions with varying degrees of intensity. The police investigators were clinical and professional, focused on establishing a timeline and gathering evidence for the case against David Crawford. The military officials were more concerned with whether Marcus had violated his duties or endangered others through his unorthodox response. The security chiefs wanted to understand how a wanted fugitive had gotten so close to the palace grounds without being intercepted earlier. Through it all, Marcus remained calm and measured in his responses. Yes, he had noticed David earlier than he reported. No, he had not felt immediately threatened. Yes, he understood that protocol required him to signal backup the moment he identified a potential threat. No, he could not fully explain why he had chosen to maintain his position rather than seek cover. When asked directly about the moment he made eye contact with David, Marcus paused before answering. How could he explain to people who had not been there, who had not seen David's eyes, that it had felt less like breaking protocol and more like honoring a deeper duty to human dignity? In the end, Marcus simply stated that he had assessed the situation and determined that de-escalation through calm presence was the most likely path to a peaceful resolution. The officials were not satisfied with this answer, but they could not argue with the results. No one had been injured. The fugitive had surrendered without violence. Property damage was minimal. By any objective measure, the incident had ended as well as anyone could hope. Still, Marcus knew he would face consequences for his actions. The military, like any large institution, valued consistency and adherence to established procedures. Marcus had deviated from those procedures, and regardless of the outcome, that deviation would not be overlooked. While Marcus endured his debriefing, David Crawford was experiencing his own interrogation in a far less comfortable setting. He had been taken to a secure holding facility at a local police station, where detectives were building their case. David had waived his right to remain silent, desperately wanting to tell his story to anyone who would listen. He spoke about Emma, about the denied insurance claims, about the impossible choice between his daughter's health and the law. He explained about the loan sharks, about his brother's gun that he had never intended to fire, about the clerk who had fought back. He described the 2 days on the run, sleeping rough, watching his life fall apart on television screens and shop windows. The detectives listened, taking notes. But David could see in their expressions that his story was not as unique as he had thought. They had heard variations of this narrative before. Desperate people making terrible choices. Law-abiding citizens pushed past their breaking points by circumstances beyond their control. David's story was tragic, but it was not special. This realization crushed something inside him. He had thought that if he could just make people listen, they would understand, perhaps even forgive. But understanding did not equal absolution. His actions would have consequences regardless of his motivations. By early evening, news of the incident had spread globally. The footage of Marcus maintaining his position while an armed man stood nearby, followed by the moment when Marcus turned to make eye contact with David, had been viewed millions of times. The video clip had been edited, analyzed, and endlessly discussed on news programs and social media platforms. People were calling Marcus a hero, praising his courage and calm under pressure. Others criticized him for taking unnecessary risks and endangering civilians. Mental health advocates were using the incident to discuss crisis intervention and the treatment of desperate individuals. Political commentators were spinning the story to fit their preferred narratives about everything from gun control to healthcare access to immigration policy. Marcus's parents saw their son on television and called immediately, but they could not reach him while he remained in debriefing. His mother wept with relief that he was safe, then with fear about what might have happened. His father, the man who had made tea for a burglar decades earlier, said nothing for a long time after watching the footage. When he finally spoke, it was simply to say that he was proud, that Marcus had learned the right lessons. That sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing were the same thing. Emma Crawford, the 7-year-old girl whose medical crisis had set these events in motion, watched the news with her mother. She did not fully understand what her father had done or why, but she understood that he was in trouble and that people were angry with him. She cried because she loved her father and wanted him home. She cried because other children at school would now know her as the daughter of the man who held a gun at Buckingham Palace. She cried because even at 7, she understood that life would never be the same again. Sarah Chen, the negotiator who had helped bring the situation to a peaceful conclusion, was also being debriefed. Her superiors praised her quick response and professional handling of the crisis. Sarah accepted their compliments but privately acknowledged that Marcus Tenderson's actions had done more to de-escalate the situation than her trained negotiation techniques. She had been following a script, however skillfully. Marcus had responded from a place of genuine human connection. Sarah had seen many standoffs in her career, and she knew that this one had been different, that something profound had happened between the guard and the desperate man that transcended tactics and training as night fell over London. Marcus was finally released from debriefing with instructions to return the following day for further discussions. He was told not to speak to the media under any circumstances. He was told that an investigation into his conduct would be conducted, and that he should consider carefully whether his actions had been appropriate. He was told in the careful language of bureaucracy that his future as a ceremonial guard was uncertain. Marcus absorbed these statements without protest. He had known there would be consequences. He accepted them as the price of doing what he believed was right. Marcus left the palace. Through a side entrance, to avoid the media circus that had gathered at the main gates, he made his way through London's streets that felt surreal after the intensity of the day. Everywhere he looked, he saw his own face on newspaper stands and television screens and pub windows. He heard snippets of conversation from passers-by, people discussing the incident without knowing they walked past the guard at its center. Marcus pulled his coat tighter and kept walking, wanting only to reach his modest flat in Brixton where he could process the day in private. But privacy was no longer possible. When Marcus reached his building, he found reporters camped outside, their cameras ready, their questions prepared. They called his name, asked for comments, wanted his story. Marcus said nothing, pushing through the crowd and into his building, where the landlady apologized for letting them gather, but explained she had no authority to remove them from the public street. Marcus thanked her and climbed the stairs to his second-floor flat, aware that his life had changed irrevocably in the space of a single morning. The investigation into Marcus Henderson's conduct took 3 weeks. During this time, Marcus was placed on administrative leave, effectively suspended from his duties, while military officials and palace security conducted their review. The days stretched long and uncomfortable. Marcus was not accustomed to idleness, and the forced inactivity gave him too much time to replay the incident in his mind, questioning decisions that had been made in split seconds, wondering if he truly had chosen the best path, or if he had simply been lucky that his unconventional approach had worked. The media attention did not fade as Marcus had hoped it would. If anything, it intensified as more details about David Crawford emerged. Investigative journalists uncovered the full story of Emma's medical crisis, the denied insurance claims, and the impossible financial burden placed on a working-class family. Public opinion began to shift in complicated ways. David was still a criminal who had committed armed robbery and endangered civilians, but he was also increasingly seen as a victim of a broken healthcare system. The nuance made people uncomfortable. Society preferred clear villains and heroes, not morally ambiguous situations. Where everyone was partially right and partially wrong, Marcus received hundreds of messages during his suspension. Some came through official channels, letters forwarded by the palace administration. Others found him through social media accounts he rarely used. The messages ranged from supportive to critical to bizarre. Parents wrote to thank him for showing their children what real courage looked like. Military veterans criticized him for breaking protocol and potentially endangering others. Mental health advocates praised his compassionate response to a person in crisis. Security professionals argued that his actions, however well-intentioned, set a dangerous precedent. Religious leaders wrote about the spiritual dimensions of seeing humanity in everyone, even enemies. Political activists tried to recruit him for various causes. Marcus read some of these messages, but stopped when the volume became overwhelming. He was not a symbol or a statement. He was a man who had made a choice based on his values and his reading of a specific situation. The attempt to transform him into something larger than that felt dishonest. Marcus thought often of his father during these weeks, wishing he could ask for advice, but knowing his parents were being harassed by media and needed space. He spent his days walking London's streets, anonymous in civilian clothes, thinking about who he was and who he wanted to be. David Crawford's legal situation moved forward during this same period. He was formally charged with armed robbery, weapons offenses, and several related crimes. His public defenders were competent but overworked. David's case was not unique enough to warrant special attention from the justice system. The prosecutors were willing to discuss a plea agreement. Given David's lack of criminal history and the mitigating circumstances around his daughter's medical needs, the sentence would still be substantial years in prison, but less than he might receive if he went to trial and lost Emma. Crawford's condition worsened while her father sat in jail awaiting trial. The stress had accelerated the deterioration of her heart function. Doctors now classified her surgery as urgent rather than elective. The hospital agreed to perform the procedure despite the family's inability to pay. A crowdfunding campaign launched by a sympathetic social worker raised enough money to cover most of the costs. Emma underwent surgery during the second week of Marcus's suspension. The procedure was successful, and the little girl who loved ballet and strawberry ice cream was expected to make a full recovery. David wept when he received the news in his cell, relief and regret mixing in equal measure. His daughter would live, but he would not be there to watch her grow up. The investigation into Marcus's conduct concluded on a gray Thursday morning in November. Marcus was called to a formal hearing at the palace, where he sat before a panel of senior military officials and security chiefs. They had reviewed all the evidence, watched the footage repeatedly, interviewed witnesses, and consulted with experts in crisis management and tactical response. Their conclusions were nuanced, which in the military often meant that no one was entirely satisfied, but everyone could live with the outcome. The panel acknowledged that Marcus had violated protocol by not immediately signaling backup when he identified a potential threat. They noted that his decision to maintain his position rather than seek cover could have endangered civilians if the situation had escalated. They criticized his choice to break ceremonial stance and make eye contact with an armed individual. All of these actions, considered in isolation, represented failures to follow established procedures. However, the panel also recognized that the incident had ended peacefully, with no injuries and minimal disruption. They acknowledged testimony from negotiator Sarah Chen that Marcus's calm presence had likely contributed to the peaceful resolution. They noted character references from commanding officers, describing Marcus as a dedicated and thoughtful soldier. The panel's decision was announced without fanfare. Marcus Henderson would receive a formal reprimand on his record for failure to follow protocol. He would be required to undergo additional training in threat assessment and crisis response. He would be placed on probation for 6 months, during which his performance would be closely monitored. However, he would be allowed to return to his duties as a ceremonial guard if he agreed to these conditions. The message was clear. Marcus had done something both wrong and right, and the institution would split the difference. Marcus accepted the decision without comment, signed the required paperwork, and left the hearing room feeling neither vindicated nor punished, just tired. He would return to his post, stand in his red tunic and bearskin hat, and maintain the stoic presence that tourists photographed endlessly. Life would return to something resembling normal, though the incident would follow him forever. His fellow guards would treat him differently now, some with increased respect, others with suspicion. Commanding officers would watch him more carefully. The tourists would include people who recognized him from the news footage, who wanted to take photos with the guard who had stared down an armed fugitive. 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, Marcus returned to duty. His first shift back was deliberately low-key. A midnight rotation when tourist traffic was minimal and media attention unlikely. Marcus stood at his familiar post, feeling the weight of his rifle and the familiar discomfort of his ceremonial uniform. The November night was cold, and his breath misted in the air. Around him, the palace grounds were quiet, except for the distant sounds of London traffic and the measured footsteps of his fellow guards maintaining their patrols. During his shift, Marcus had time to reflect on everything that had happened. He thought about David Crawford, now serving a 7-year sentence after accepting a plea agreement. He thought about Emma Crawford, recovering from her surgery and facing a childhood marked by her father's absence. He thought about all the messages he had received, the people who had projected their own beliefs and agendas onto his actions. He thought about the investigation, the reprimand, the probation. Most of all, he thought about the moment when he had turned to look at David, breaking every rule to honor what felt like a higher obligation. Marcus wondered if he would make the same choice again if faced with a similar situation. The honest answer was that he did not know. Each crisis was unique, each person different, each set of circumstances requiring its own response. What had worked with David Crawford might not work with someone else. The protocols existed for good reasons, born from decades of experience and countless incidents. Marcus respected those protocols even as he acknowledged that sometimes, rarely, there were moments when human judgment had to override institutional procedure. As dawn approached and his shift neared its end, Marcus noticed a figure standing at the edge of the courtyard. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the person's posture. As the figure moved closer, passing under a streetlight, Marcus recognized Sarah Chen, the negotiator from that October morning. She was not in uniform, just a civilian coat and scarf, and she carried 2 cups of coffee. Sarah approached slowly, respectfully maintaining the appropriate distance from Marcus's post, but making clear through her body language that she wanted to speak. When Marcus's replacement arrived for the shift change, Sarah was still waiting. Marcus completed the ceremonial handover, then walked to where Sarah stood. She offered him one of the coffees without saying anything, and they stood together in the early morning cold. 2 people who had shared an extraordinary experience and were still processing its implications. After a long silence, Sarah spoke quietly about her own doubts and questions. She was trained to handle crisis situations, but the incident with David Crawford had challenged her assumptions about what actually worked in desperate moments. She admitted that watching Marcus's calm presence had taught her something no training manual could convey. They talked for nearly an hour, 2 professionals dissecting a crisis from different perspectives, finding common ground in their shared commitment to preserving human life and dignity. Sarah mentioned that she had visited David Crawford in prison, wanting to understand him better and to close the circle on a case that had affected her deeply. David had spoken at length about the moment when Marcus looked at him, about how that simple gesture of recognition had broken through his desperation and reminded him that surrender did not mean erasure. Sarah thought Marcus should know this, should understand the impact of his choice beyond the bureaucratic response of reprimands and investigations. Marcus listened, absorbing this information, feeling something shift inside him. The past weeks had been difficult, full of second-guessing and criticism. Hearing that his instinct had been right, that the human connection had mattered, provided a validation that official proceedings could never offer. Marcus thanked Sarah for seeking him out, for sharing David's words, for confirming that compassion in crisis was not weakness, but strength. They parted as colleagues who had become something like friends, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. The months following Marcus's return to duty brought gradual changes, subtle shifts in how he was perceived and how he perceived himself. The media attention finally faded as news stories captured public imagination, and the incident at Buckingham Palace became historical rather than current. Marcus's face stopped appearing on television screens and newspaper front pages. The reporters camping outside his flat found more pressing stories to chase. Life returned to its normal rhythms, though nothing was quite the same as it had been before that. October morning. Marcus's probationary period passed without incident. He performed his duties exactly as required, following every protocol with precision, giving his superiors no cause for concern or criticism. His fellow guards, initially uncertain how to treat him after the incident and investigation, slowly relaxed back into comfortable camaraderie. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when someone would start to reference the incident, then stop themselves. But these became less frequent as weeks turned to months. Marcus was becoming simply Marcus again, rather than the guard who had stared down an armed fugitive. But Marcus himself had changed in ways both visible and invisible. He found himself more attuned to the tourists who visited the palace, seeing them not as an undifferentiated mass, but as individuals carrying their own stories and struggles. The man in the cheap coat might be working 3 jobs to support his family. The woman checking her phone constantly might be dealing with a medical crisis. The teenager acting out might be crying for attention because no one at home was listening. Marcus could not help everyone, could not solve their problems, but he could stand his post with the awareness that every person deserved dignity and recognition. During his off-duty hours, Marcus began volunteering with a crisis intervention charity that worked with homeless populations in London. It started almost accidentally when he stumbled upon their outreach van during one of his walks through the city. The volunteers were offering food, warm clothes, and conversation to people living rough on the streets. Marcus stopped to watch, reminded of his own brush with someone in crisis, and before he knew it, he had signed up to help. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, bringing him face to face with people society had abandoned, but it also felt meaningful in ways his ceremonial duties sometimes did not. Through this volunteer work, Marcus met Thomas, a former soldier who had struggled with PTSD after leaving the military and had eventually lost his housing, his family, and his sense of purpose. Thomas had been living on the streets for 2 years when Marcus met him, sleeping in doorways and surviving on charity. over shared cups of tea from the outreach van. Thomas and Marcus talked about their experiences in service, the difficulty of transitioning back to civilian life, and the thin line between stability and catastrophe. Marcus saw in Thomas a possible version of himself if circumstances had been slightly different. If his support systems had failed at crucial moments, Marcus helped Thomas navigate the complex bureaucracy of social services, accompanying him to appointments and advocating when the system seemed designed to frustrate rather than assist. It took months of persistent effort. But eventually Thomas secured temporary housing and began receiving the mental health treatment he had needed for years. The progress was slow and uncertain, with setbacks and disappointments along the way, but there was movement forward. Thomas started attending support groups for veterans, reconnected with his adult daughter, and began talking about the future in terms of possibilities rather than just survival. This small success with Thomas gave Marcus a sense of purpose beyond his ceremonial duties. He realized that the lesson from his father's midnight encounter with a burglar, the lesson he had applied during the standoff with David Crawford, was not a one-time principle but a way of living. Every person deserved to be seen as human, especially those whom society found easiest to dismiss or criminalize. Marcus could not change systems or solve structural problems, but he could offer presence and recognition to individuals struggling in those systems. Emma Crawford turned 8 years old in January. Several months after her father's imprisonment, the little girl who loved ballet and strawberry ice cream was thriving after her surgery. Her energy levels returning to normal, her future no longer shadowed by cardiac concerns. Her mother had found work as a school aide. The crowdfunding campaign had covered most medical bills, and life was slowly finding a new equilibrium. Emma visited her father in prison every other weekend. The visits strictly supervised and emotionally difficult, but maintaining a connection that both desperately needed. David Crawford was serving his sentence at a medium-security facility outside London. Prison was every bit as harsh as he had feared, but he was surviving it. He attended education programs, worked in the prison library, participated in counseling sessions exploring the choices that had led him here. David was not excusing what he had done, but he was trying to understand it and to ensure he never became that desperate, thoughtless person again. He wrote letters to Emma that her mother read aloud during visits, letters full of apologies and love and promises to do better. He also wrote a letter to Marcus Henderson, though he never sent it, finding it impossible to articulate the gratitude and shame he felt toward the guard who had seen his humanity, when everyone else saw only threat. In late spring, nearly 8 months after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at the palace. During a shift change, he was informed that someone was requesting to speak with him. Marcus assumed it was another journalist, or perhaps someone from the investigation wanting to follow up. But when he saw who waited in the visitor area, he was genuinely surprised. It was David Crawford's wife, Helen. Accompanied by young Emma, they had come to thank Marcus in person for his role in bringing the October incident to a peaceful conclusion. The meeting was brief and emotional. Helen explained that she wanted Emma to meet the man who had helped her father surrender without anyone getting hurt. She wanted her daughter to understand that even in terrible situations, there could be moments of grace and compassion. Emma, shy but determined, presented Marcus with a drawing she had made. It showed a guard in a red uniform standing very still while the sun rose over the palace. The drawing was simple, but somehow captured something essential about that October morning. Marcus accepted it with genuine gratitude, kneeling down to Emma's level to thank her properly. Helen spoke quietly about the difficult months since David's imprisonment, about rebuilding a life from scattered pieces, about trying to help Emma understand that her father had made terrible mistakes but was still a good person, capable of growth and redemption. She did not excuse David's actions, but she thanked Marcus for treating him like a human being rather than a monster during those critical moments. Helen explained that David spoke often about the guard who had looked at him without hatred, who had offered silent recognition when the world had reduced him to a headline. That moment had given David something to hold on to during his darkest hours in prison. Marcus listened to Helen's words with deep humility. He had never sought recognition or praise for his actions that morning. He had simply responded according to values learned from his father and refined through his own experiences. Hearing how much that response had meant to David and his family was overwhelming in ways Marcus had not expected. After Helen and Emma left, Marcus returned to his post, feeling the full weight of human interconnection. The way small choices rippled outward, affecting lives in ways impossible to predict or measure. The investigation's formal conclusion came in June, exactly 8 months after the October incident. Marcus's probation ended with a positive evaluation from his commanding officers. The reprimand would remain on his record permanently, but his conduct since returning to duty had been exemplary. Marcus was informed that he could continue as a ceremonial guard for as long as he wished. Though opportunities for advancement might be limited given the mark on his record, Marcus accepted this without complaint. He had never sought advancement or glory. He had joined the ceremonial guard to serve with dignity and to honor traditions larger than himself. Summer brought the usual waves of tourists to Buckingham Palace, their cameras ready, their excitement palpable. Marcus stood at his post in the heat, his red tunic heavy, his bearskin hat uncomfortable, his face carefully neutral. Tourists took their photographs, children waved and giggled. Tour guides explained the history and significance of the ceremonial guard. To casual observers, Marcus was indistinguishable from any other guard. A stoic figure in traditional uniform maintaining centuries-old traditions. But those who looked closely might have noticed something different in his bearing. A depth of presence that suggested someone who had faced crisis and emerged with hard-won wisdom. On quiet nights, when tourist traffic was minimal, Marcus sometimes thought about David Crawford sitting in his prison cell, about Emma Crawford practicing her ballet steps, about Thomas finding his way back from homelessness, about all the people struggling in visible and invisible ways throughout the city. He thought about his father making tea for a frightened young burglar decades ago, about the lesson that true courage meant maintaining your humanity when everything pushed you toward fear and violence. Marcus understood now that his moment at Buckingham Palace had not been an aberration or a lucky break. It had been the natural expression of values cultivated over a lifetime, values tested in a crucible and found adequate. The story of the royal guard who faced an armed fugitive with calm recognition rather than force or panic had faded from public consciousness. But its lessons remained for those who had lived through it. Marcus Henderson continued his duties, standing motionless hour after hour, a symbol of tradition and continuity. But he was also a reminder that behind every uniform, every role, every institutional position, there was a human being capable of choice. And sometimes, in the most desperate moments, the choice to see another person's humanity could change everything. That October morning had taught Marcus that the most powerful weapon he possessed was not the rifle he carried, but the compassion he chose to extend, even when it defied protocol and invited criticism. It was a lesson he would carry with him long after his service as a ceremonial guard ended. A truth more permanent than any uniform or tradition.